Hey.
Oh, hey. Yep.
Hey, what's up? What's up? You have the 4-liter engine in your Ranger, right? Yes, I do. And those are infamous for cracking heads? Yeah, but I don't have to worry about that. You sure? Yeah, I don't have any of the symptoms like overheating and stuff like that, so. Are you sure? It would show the symptoms, right? 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 All right, I whipped out my head for you guys, and now I want to show you my crack. All right, so I wanted to show you what I found with my 99 Ford Ranger with the 4.0 liter pushrod engine. I obviously took the heads off and found both of them had the casting air crack between the intake and exhaust valve. These would be located on cylinder 3 and 4, but due to how the heads are orientated on the engine, they're kind of like mirrored from each other. It's actually in the same spot. So both of these are set identical because they're the same head. So if you bought heads, which I will get into, they're exactly the same. They can be put on either side in the specific orientation of the engine. They have a crack in the same spot. So that's where the casting error occurred with these Ford cylinder heads for these engines, and mine was lucky enough to have them on both. What I found was the strangest is I didn't think that that was actually a problem. When I went into it, I thought I just had a head gasket leak externally. I didn't know I had anything internally. So what were the symptoms that led me to find the cracked cylinder heads in this engine? It actually started with the radiator cap. I was finding as I was driving, it was not holding pressure in the cooling system. So once you get it up to operating temp, something you can do is grab the upper radiator hose. If obviously if it's not crazy hot, but squeeze it, and it should be pretty stiff. It should have a lot of pressure in it. If you find it and it's the same as when it's cold, or a good example is if you take the radiator cap off and squeeze it and it's still the same, then it's not holding pressure. And that means that, in my case, the radiator cap needed to be replaced. So I replaced it with a new one, and immediately it started leaking coolant when it got hot. So anywhere that coolant flowed, it would leak the water pump, and then the big ones was the cylinder head, specifically the driver's side cylinder head externally. So where the cylinder head and the engine met, coolant was coming out under the exhaust manifold, which is another common thing with this engine. You'll see this thing is full of issues, man. So that was the first thing that started to happen, was those external leaks, and it happened immediately. And I would have little puddles of coolant anytime I drove after it sat for a little bit. Nothing crazy, but enough to where you would notice it. It's not oil, it's coolant. And then something that was progressing worse and worse is I would have misfires after a first startup. So if I let the car sit for a little bit, which I usually did, it would probably be a few days to a week before I would drive. And each time it would have a misfire. And a lot of the times it wouldn't even register like a pending code. But when it did, it would be cylinder 3. So that's the cylinder passenger side in the back. And I thought that was the only case. I even went into spark plugs and possibly a fuel injector, like thinking it may be that, the ignition coil. Obviously it wasn't, but something that did pop up was one of the worst days that I had where it had a misfire. Both 3 and 4 popped up as pending code. However, it clears up, maybe after 5 to 10 seconds, and then giving it a little gas, that's getting the water out of there. And then it never really came back for the rest of that day. I could drive it around and everything was fine. So probably I was thinking more of an upper or a lower intake manifold leak, or possibly a head gasket. I was thinking maybe the head gasket. as the other side was leaking. But I was not thinking cracked cylinder head. And that was the other thing that may be worth looking into, is it didn't affect runnability. I wasn't having lean codes because of it. It was leaner than now, so kind of like a spoiler. My numbers now, everything's below 10%, whereas before I'd be about 15% increase in pulse width or fuel trim. So my trims have definitely gone down because of it, but I wasn't throwing a code, and it actually ran quite well. So those signs weren't there in terms of like bubbles in the coolant, which you would think would be a pretty big one. I never had air in the cooling system that was visible, like it wasn't coming out of the reservoir or anything like that. You could take the cap off when it would run and you wouldn't see bubbles come out. So that was really strange. I'm sure it probably would have gotten worse. It probably would have gotten to that point if I never did anything, but for where it was, that wasn't an issue. It was actually the external leak that made me change the head gaskets. So what causes this? Obviously there's a casting flaw that makes it very susceptible to it, but it's going to be overheating that creates the crack. So it needs to get hot, over operating temp to then cause it to crack. And something that I had was the coolant switch, your heater valve. That was actually leaking quite a bit, and it actually allowed a lot of air into the heater core of the car. So, one of the symptoms I had early on was that you could run the heater in the car and it wouldn't get warm because that air would be trapped in there. It wasn't allowing coolant to properly go through because it was leaking so bad. I just didn't notice it that first year, and I did replace it, and it was pretty, fragile. It cracked in all these places and stuff. I did get a new one in there and immediately fixed that heater core issue. I thought it was the motor that controlled the vent, to let hot or cold air in. No, it was that. It had air in the heater core. And I think that was allowing a lot of air in that engine, when you would operate it. Something I did early on was I replaced the thermostat with a lower running temp thermostat. So I think the OEM's 195 degrees Fahrenheit, and I put a 180, and it barely would register on the thermostat, inside your dash. And so that was always something that was concerning, but I just chalked it up to that. But it could have been a lot of air in that system. Once I replaced it, it seemed like it got a little bit better. So that tells me it's probably air. But that was probably something that led to it. And I know a lot of people with these cars, again, another infamous part that fails on these Fords, I think the trend of everything here. But also I did want to say, it always had a bit of a misfire when I got the truck from my grandpa. I thought originally it was that lower intake manifold, the gaskets in there. I will say whoever did it before me did a really, really poor job. So it could have been two. There was really some questionable handiwork done to this truck. So it could have been part of that. When I replaced the lower intake manifold, or what ended up happening is I tightened it to check to think, oh yeah, that's what's causing it, is it's a loose lower intake manifold that's allowing coolant into cylinder 3 that causes a misfire. I actually tightened it down and it fixed it. What I think was happening was it probably was leaking there. The cylinder head was probably already cracked. It wasn't pressurizing because the cap still hadn't been replaced at that point for the radiator. And so it probably wasn't misfiring nearly as much, and it felt like it fixed it. Or, maybe it wasn't really registering as a misfire like it was prior. So I kind of felt like it was fixed, but obviously once you pressurize the system, coolant went right back into the cylinder. So nothing was fixed. It's hard to say though, but what I do know is they were cracked when I took the heads off. So that was my big discovery. All right, so what did I do? The good, the bad, and the ugly, right? I ended up looking for a company that made cylinder heads. There's a couple options that I saw. Rock Auto had Engine Tech cylinder heads that you would have to put the valves on. There's eBay cylinder heads, probably around the $200 to $300 range. And then there's other companies. One that stuck out to me was King cylinder heads. And they actually sold a pair of casted cylinder heads in the USA with all new valves and everything included in the heads. And it was for $750 to the door. Very, very expensive compared to the other options. However, something I did do was I did call the company, and they let me know that the castings are in the USA. They do all the manufacturing and the assembly of the heads. And they said for these ones, the design they use has fixed the casting issue that Ford had. So in terms of that head cracking again, it should not be as susceptible to the cracks like these get from slight overheating. So it sounds as though the head issue has been fixed. So these are complete heads that I can just throw on the engine, which is something I decided to do with how low mileage I have. I have about 130,000 miles on the truck. To me, that made sense to put brand new heads. Very expensive though. There's a lot of cheaper options. However, the Engine Tech heads are casted in China. So deal with that. And then who knows about, I wouldn't even entertain the idea of the eBay heads because I'll get to it. The job was tough. What gasket set did I use? I ended up going on Rock Auto, and they have a full head gasket set. So it has, obviously the head gaskets. It has the exhaust manifold gaskets, all the gaskets that go into the intake and everything like that. I bought the Engine Tech one. I think it was about $75. Probably one of the cheaper ones, but most inclusive. And I did tell the guy at the King Cylinder Heads that's what I was planning on doing. And he said that, in his opinion, they're a good cylinder, they're a good gasket set, and that was probably the best value for what I was. He was saying for quality and value, what I was doing was the best. But I'm going to have to disagree with him on the gasket set. I did not think the Engine Tech cylinder gaskets, cylinder head gasket set was very good. I don't have a picture of it. This is something I learned, but I'm going to tell you guys, is the cylinder head gaskets were really interesting. I wish I took a picture of it, but they look like they had to be put on upside down. So most of the markings tell you top front or whatever, and they look like they were on the wrong side. And it's hard to see, but a lot of these little crevices here are really unique. So when you put a cylinder head gasket up against it, kind of is off a little bit, you'll see it. And then it actually interferes with push rods if it's not on right. I had to flip them and put them on so they wouldn't go on the other way or whatever. If I wanted the front, the label that says front on it to be in the front, they had to be flipped over. I did that. I haven't had any problems, but that is something I did. So we'll see if it causes issues. I didn't like was it included a lot of gaskets like the intake or the butterfly valve gasket and all the, like the idle air control valve gasket and things like that. And none of those have to come off when you take off the intake, the upper intake manifold. So it was useless gaskets that I didn't use. And then the ones that I did, like I've had a pretty extensive video on the lower or the fuel rail gaskets, how you need the spacer and both the gaskets. I think if you're going to do this, buy the gaskets individually, buy the head gasket individually. I'm not sure on the brand which would be better, but I did not like the Engine Tech ones. And then obviously I would buy a spacer and I would buy those fuel rail gaskets that go on top and bottom of the spacer separately. And honestly, that's probably all you're gonna need for gaskets. You would probably save money than buying the Engine Tech set, and you would get better quality gaskets. Again, I don't know the brand for the head gasket. I would probably assume the Victorines and something, things like that are probably going to be pretty dang good, but I don't know. Didn't use them, can't say. But I know the Engine Tech was not preferred. So the exhaust, I don't have it on here, but the exhaust is held on by studs from the factory. And what I did is I removed the cylinder heads, which was very difficult to do with those studs in. Because you have to support the exhaust, jimmy rig these heads out, and they're cast iron, they're very, very heavy, and it's horrible experience. what I ended up doing was putting those studs on the new heads to try to jimmy rig back into the engine, and that sucked. Like, it's not the way to do it. I know that now. I put it all in, bolted it all up, which I'm pretty sure I scraped out the cylinder head gasket pretty good doing that. What are you gonna do at this point, right? I read about it. I should have done this before, but everyone uses bolts, who does this. So just do that. It's so much easier to put the cylinder heads on. What I did was I had to support the exhaust manifold, the exhaust manifold. I had to fit it. I mean, it took me 2 hours on each side just to fit it in without tearing up everything, getting it all set down, put in. And what I ended up doing was tearing the new exhaust gaskets. I had to put the old ones back in. And then there's a way to do it because there's a strip that holds them. And so on the driver's side, I put it in wrong. So the big strip was blocking like the spark plugs, the boots going. It was this whole big thing. When you go put your new cylinder heads on, buy bolts to bolt on your exhaust manifold, because that's what everybody does. I know that now. If it ever happens again, that's what I'm gonna do. Don't use those studs. So the last thing I want to say is there was a lot of big items that I didn't replace while I was in there, mostly because it's so easy to get to. So like the water pump, spark plugs, things like that. I didn't replace while I had everything apart, but I did clean everything. And the reason, like I said, is everything's just so easy to get to on this engine that it's not really worth replacing until it fails. However, what I would say to do is the radiator hoses. Those are gonna be very easy to replace. One, because you have to drain all the coolant, and two, because you're gonna have the top one off at least to do this job. Is I would definitely replace those as you do this job. It is the best insurance to make sure that your cooling system is, like has proper control of the pressure and stuff like that, is that I used my old ones and the top one was so swollen from the overheating, which I didn't notice originally, that it was just not safe to use. So I put everything back together, filled it up with coolant, and my top radiator hose would get so expanded from the pressure because it lost a lot of its integrity due to overheating that it was kind of not safe to drive for a bit. So I ended up having to drain all the coolant again, put new radiator hoses on with all the stuff on, which is not nearly as easy as when it's all off. It took a 10-minute job and made it a 2-hour job. But honestly, everything else can kind of wait. Everything's just so close, so I would just wait until it needs to be replaced. Like now that it's all done, I did some pretty cool things with it. So the valve covers, I did paint blue, so like a Ford blue. So it kind of has this like really clean look in the engine bay. Really, really nice. So like I said earlier, but I'll kind of talk about it now, is the fuel trims are wonderful. I did have some suspicion that the fuel pump is aftermarket, and that's one of the reasons that it runs a little more on the lean side, is because the pressure is not quite factory. And now I really believe that is because at idle, the fuel trims are probably about 7%, and then when you drive, it goes up to like 10. So it actually increases trim, so that means it runs a little bit leaner when you hit the gas, which tells me the pressure isn't being properly compensated when you drive, which is probably pretty normal, but it's like off by a little bit. I would think you'd probably want to get closer to 0 at idle and then, increase, 3 to 5% as you drive. I think that the pump's aftermarket, and another sign of that is that the fuel gauge stays full until like you're at a half a tank, and then it starts going down. I track that with the mileage and stuff. So that is probably something in the future I will replace. We'll see if I wait for it to die or if I get sick of it. Who knows? But that will probably be something that I will show, its entirety on this channel when I finally get to it. But for the Ranger, I think all of the major work pretty much has been done in this engine. I fixed the big infamous problem, and I gotta tell you, man, that thing runs sweet. It's definitely a late 90s Ford vehicle. So even with all of this done, it's loud, man. It sounds kind of like a diesel when it runs, especially at idle. I wouldn't say the idle is, it's not like a new car. It's definitely a 90s Ford truck. Don't try to look for perfection with this. Think This vehicle at its best is probably a C+. So if you get C+ parts and do C+ labor, it's pretty much factory, right? I am really, really happy with where this is at. It passes smog, you know, with flying colors, especially for a 99. Drives sweet, has a lot of power, so in terms of towing and stuff like that, be pretty set. I cleaned the fuel injectors, so that was something that I did. I was able to clean them all up. They have tools on Amazon and stuff to do all that. So it's pretty set. Like, I feel like for its age, it's probably gonna be the closest to running at its peak for right now. So unless some things pop up to kind of work on, I just wanna give you a heads up where I was work-wise. Something I do plan on doing probably in the springtime is my 4Runner. It's a 2001. I am not sure when the timing belt has ever been done on that thing, and has 260 plus thou on it. That is something I will do, and we're gonna go with the infamous the cam seals and plug replacement. So we're gonna do all of the big ticket items for that 3.4 liter in the 4Runner. That will be something that I think I'm just gonna show in its entirety on this, just to kind of get back to it. So that was just my little update on the Ranger. I know that the videos just aren't anything, you know, they're not coming out like crazy, but I want this to be more informational. I want this to do the process, to explain what I think works, what doesn't, to have anybody, like, especially with these Rangers, there's a lot of information, but there's just not a lot of people, it seems like, have tested it and give really clear, concise answers that aren't like 10 plus years old on these forums. There's just people who don't care about these vehicles anymore, which is kind of, you know, it's kind of sad, because it's how hard is it to find a small little truck nowadays, especially with these 4.0 liters? That's pretty sweet, right? It's like a race car in these little tiny trucks. It's awesome. It's something that that I want to focus more on correct information. I want to be able to help people who run into this, so it's not really set up for max views. It's not going to be that kind of rage bait or anything like that. It's definitely going to be just to help people. So I'll try to do that when it comes up, you know, for small engines, for cars and stuff like that, especially the cars I have. Yeah, that's sort of where this channel, I think, is going, is it's going to be more of a helpful, informative thing for more niche items that we kind of run into. So if you guys like that, hey man, subscribe. It's awesome. It's, you know, I'm kind of climbing there to 1,000, so I might make like a couple of cents on some videos, which would be cool. But, you know, it's like, this is more to help people. So if you found it helpful, just let me know. I hope that, you know, these little trucks stay on the road as long as they can, because they're wonderful. The parts are dirt cheap compared to anything else. And the thing is you can do the work. You know, if you run into issues, let me know. And if I start seeing a lot of the same stuff, maybe I will do something a little more instructive on whatever problems people are running into. So comment if you like it. And if you want to just say something mean to me, that is good for the algorithm. It shows engagement, even if it's negative. So go ahead. I'll take it at this point. So again, thank you, and hopefully it helps somebody out there.